The dust from the moving train swirled into Rebecca's face as strong hands gripped her arms and shoved her backward. The conductor's voice ringing in her ears about payment and thieves, and the law. The ground rushed up to meet her with brutal force, and she tumbled down the embankment in a tangle of worn calico skirts and scraped palms. The world spinning as the train's whistle screamed its departure into the hot Colorado afternoon of 1882. When she finally stopped rolling, she lay there gasping, every inch of her body aching, watching helplessly as the locomotive that was supposed to carry her to a new life chugged away toward Pueblo without her. "Madam, you all right?" The voice came from above, deep and concerned, tinged with that particular drawl she'd come to recognize since crossing into the territories. Rebecca blinked through the dirt coating her eyelashes and saw a silhouette against the blazing sun, a man in a wide-brimmed hat extending a calloused hand down to her. "That was quite a fall you took there." She wanted to refuse help, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity after being thrown from a train like common trash, but her body had other ideas. Her ankle throbbed something fierce, and she could feel blood trickling down her temple. With a reluctant nod, she grasped his hand, surprised by the gentleness with which he pulled her to her feet despite the obvious strength in his grip. "Thank you," she managed, though the words came out shakier than she intended. Now that she was standing, she could see him properly. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of sage brush, maybe 25 or 26 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck, where it touched his collar. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, dusty leather chaps over worn denim, a faded red shirt, and a kerchief tied loosely around his neck. "Preston Dalton," he said, not releasing her hand immediately, as if worried she might topple over again. "I saw what happened from up on that ridge. That conductor had no call throwing a lady off like that." Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Colorado sun. Rebecca Norton, and he had every right, I suppose. I couldn't pay the fare. The admission burned her throat. She'd spent the last of her money on the initial ticket east from Kansas, not realizing the route would require transfers and additional fees. When the conductor had demanded another $3 she didn't have, she tried to explain, tried to plead, but he'd been unmoved by her situation. Preston's jaw tightened. "Still no excuse for treating a woman that way. You hurt anywhere serious?" She took mental inventory. Her ankle was tender but bore her weight. Her palms were scraped raw and she could feel a goose egg forming on her temple, but nothing seemed broken. "I'll live. Though I'm not certain what I'll do now. Pueblo was supposed to be my destination. I have a position waiting there, teaching at the schoolhouse." He studied her for a long moment, those sage-green eyes taking in her threadbare dress, the carpetbag that had tumbled down the embankment with her, the desperation she couldn't quite hide. "Well then, Miss Norton, seems to me you still need to get to Pueblo. My horse is just up the ridge there, and I was heading into town anyway. Why don't you let me help you collect your things, and we'll see about getting you on the next train that comes through. My treat for the fare." Rebecca stiffened. "I couldn't possibly accept charity from a stranger." "Ain't charity," Preston said easily, already moving to retrieve her carpetbag. "Think of it as an investment in education. Pueblo needs good teachers, and you look like you've got grit enough to handle those wild kids. Besides, my sister will be one of your pupils come September, so really, I'm just making sure she has someone qualified to teach her reading and arithmetic." Something about the way he said it, practical and matter-of-fact rather than pitying, made it easier to swallow. Rebecca nodded slowly. "I'll pay you back, every cent, once I receive my first month's wages." "Fair enough," Preston agreed, though the slight upturn of his mouth suggested he wasn't particularly concerned about repayment. He handed her the carpet bag, then gestured up the ridge. "Think you can make the climb, or should I carry you?" "I can walk just fine," Rebecca said quickly, though her first step made her wince. Preston noticed, of course, and before she could protest, he'd positioned himself at her side, letting her lean on him as they made their slow way up the rocky incline. The train tracks cut through a desolate stretch of prairie here, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but scrub brush and red rocks stretching to the distant mountains. Rebecca tried not to think about what would have happened if Preston hadn't been nearby, if she'd been left stranded out here with no water and no way forward. His horse was a handsome paint gelding, patiently grazing on the sparse grass. Preston tied her carpet bag to the saddle, then turned to face her with an apologetic expression. "Going to have to ride double, I'm afraid. Hope you don't mind." Rebecca had never been this close to a man who wasn't family, certainly never pressed against one on horseback, but circumstances left little room for propriety. Preston mounted first, then reached down and pulled her up behind him with surprising ease, settling her sideways on the horse's rump. "Hold on tight now," he instructed. "Station's about 8 miles south. Next train through won't be until tomorrow morning, but there's a boarding house nearby where you can rest up." She wrapped her arms around his waist, acutely aware of the solid muscle beneath his shirt, the warmth of him against her. The horse started moving, and she tightened her grip, pressing her cheek against Preston's back as the world swayed with the animal's gait. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clop of hooves, the creak of leather, and the ever-present wind whistling through the prairie grass. "You got family in Pueblo?" Preston asked after a time, his voice carrying back to her. "No," Rebecca admitted. "I'm alone in the world. My parents died of fever last winter, and there was nothing left to keep me in Wichita. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Pueblo, it seemed like Providence, a chance to start fresh somewhere new." She felt him nod. "I know something about that. My folks passed when I was young. Been raising my sister Sarah on my own since she was 6. She's 14 now, smart as a whip but stubborn as a mule. You'll have your hands full with her, I expect." There was affection in his voice when he spoke of his sister, and Rebecca found herself warming to this stranger who'd appeared at exactly the right moment. "What do you do, Mr. Dalton, besides rescuing unfortunate women from the prairie?" He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound she felt through his back. "Call me Preston, please. I run cattle mostly, got a small spread about 10 miles outside Pueblo. Nothing fancy, but it keeps us fed and clothed. Do some horse breaking on the side, occasional work for the bigger ranches when they need extra hands during roundup." "That sounds like hard work." "It is," he agreed, "but honest work, the kind that lets you sleep well at night knowing you earned your keep." He paused, then added, "Can't imagine teaching is much easier, though. Heard the last teacher didn't last 6 months before she married the banker's son and quit." Rebecca smiled despite herself. "I have no intention of marrying anyone, so the position should be quite secure. I'm there to teach, nothing more." "That right?" Something in Preston's tone made her blush, though she couldn't say exactly why. "Well, Pueblo's grown a fair bit in the last few years. Railroad brought in all sorts, some good folks, some less so. You'll want to be careful about where you board. Mrs. Henderson runs a respectable place on 3rd Street, takes in single ladies. I'd recommend staying clear of the rooms above the saloons, no matter how cheap they advertise." "I appreciate the advice," Rebecca said, meaning it. Everything felt overwhelming suddenly, the reality of her situation settling over her like a heavy blanket. She was truly alone in the world, dependent on the kindness of a stranger, heading toward a town she'd never seen to teach children she'd never met. If things went wrong, she had no safety net, no family to turn to, nothing but her own determination and the skills her mother had taught her. As if sensing her thoughts, Preston said quietly, "You'll do fine, Miss Norton. Takes courage to start over somewhere new, and you've clearly got that in spades. Any woman who dusts herself off after being thrown from a train and keeps going has the kind of backbone this territory respects." His words steadied her more than he could know. They rode on as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The landscape gradually shifted, the empty prairie giving way to scattered homesteads, and then more frequent buildings as they approached the outskirts of the settlement that had grown up around the train station. The station itself was a modest wooden structure, weathered by wind and sun, with a small platform and a hand-painted sign declaring it a stop on the Denver and Rio Grande Railway. A handful of people milled about, waiting for the evening freight train that would pass through without stopping. Preston dismounted, then helped Rebecca down, his hands steady on her waist as he lowered her to the ground. "Wait here," he instructed, then strode into the station. Through the window, Rebecca could see him speaking with the clerk, saw money change hands. He emerged a few minutes later with a ticket, which he pressed into her palm. 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, gets into Pueblo by 9. Rebecca looked down at the ticket, her throat tight. "I don't know how to thank you. You've been incredibly kind to a complete stranger." "Like I said, investment in Sarah's education," Preston replied, but his eyes were warm. "Now let's get you over to Mrs. Henderson's. You need to rest up and get those scrapes tended." He led his horse on foot this time, walking beside Rebecca as they made their way down the dusty main street of what she learned was called Boone, a small supply town that served the surrounding ranches. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was exactly as advertised, a neat two-story building with whitewashed walls and cheerful yellow curtains in the windows. Preston handled the negotiations with the proprietress, a stout woman with kind eyes and steel-gray hair, paying for Rebecca's room and board for the night despite her protests. "You can pay me back with that first month's wages, remember," he said, when Mrs. Henderson disappeared to prepare a room. "Consider it a loan if it sits better with you." "It does," Rebecca admitted. "And I will pay you back, Preston, I keep my word." "Never doubted it," he said. They stood in the boarding house parlor, suddenly awkward now that the immediate crisis had passed. Preston rolled the brim of his hat between his hands. "Well, I should be heading back. Got livestock to tend and a sister who'll worry if I'm too late for supper. But Miss Norton, Rebecca, if I may be so bold, might I call on you sometime, once you're settled in Pueblo?" Rebecca's heart did something strange in her chest, a flutter she hadn't expected. She'd meant what she said about having no intention of marrying, about focusing solely on her teaching position, but looking at Preston now, at the genuine concern in his expression and the goodness that seemed to radiate from him, she found herself nodding. "I'd like that. Very much." His smile transformed his face, making him look younger, almost boyish. "Good. That's real good. I come into Pueblo most Saturdays for supplies. Maybe I could take you to lunch, show you around the town proper. That would be lovely." They exchanged a few more pleasantries, settling the details, and then Preston was gone, riding off into the gathering dusk with a final wave. Rebecca stood at the parlor window watching until he disappeared from view, wondering at the strange turn her life had taken in the space of a single afternoon. Mrs. Henderson bustled back in with a basin of warm water and clean rags. "Let's get you cleaned up, dear. You've had quite an ordeal." "That Preston Dalton's a good man, you know." raised that sister of his right proper after their parents were killed in a Ute raid back in '73. Could have sent her to an orphanage, but he was barely 18 himself and insisted on keeping her. Worked himself near to death those first few years, learning ranching and parenting all at once. Rebecca let the older woman tend to her scrapes while absorbing this new information. 18 years old and suddenly responsible for a child, and he'd risen to the challenge rather than taking the easier path. It spoke volumes about his character. He's never shown interest in courting before, Mrs. Henderson continued, a knowing glint in her eye as she dabbed at the cut on Rebecca's temple. Oh, plenty of girls have tried, but Preston's always said he was too busy raising Sarah to think about romance. For him to ask to call on you, well, that's something special. Rebecca felt warmth spread through her chest, mixing with nervousness. She told herself she was done with dreams of love and marriage, that her parents' death had taught her the danger of depending on anyone else, but something about Preston made her want to reconsider. Maybe starting fresh in Colorado meant more than just a new job. Maybe it meant opening herself to possibilities she'd thought were closed forever. That night, lying in the boarding house's clean, narrow bed, Rebecca found sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept returning to sage-green eyes and calloused hands, to the feeling of safety she'd experienced pressed against Preston's back on that horse. She touched the ticket he'd bought her, running her fingers over the printed text as if it were something precious. Tomorrow she'd board the train for Pueblo. Tomorrow her new life would truly begin. And woven through it all, like a golden thread of possibility, was the promise of Preston Dalton calling on her come Saturday. The morning sun woke her early, streaming through the thin curtains with determined brightness. Mrs. Henderson provided a hearty breakfast of eggs and biscuits, refusing payment beyond what Preston had already given, and sent Rebecca off to the station with a packed lunch and instructions to visit whenever she was back in Boone. The 7 o'clock train arrived precisely on time, and Rebecca boarded with her carpetbag and Preston's ticket, choosing a seat by the window where she could watch the Colorado landscape roll past. The journey to Pueblo took less than 2 hours, the train chugging through prairie and past distant mountains, stopping briefly at 2 small settlements to take on water and discharge mail. Rebecca used the time to compose herself, to prepare mentally for meeting the school board and seeing her new home for the first time. She'd corresponded with the board president, a Mr. Thornton, who'd promised that lodging would be provided in a small cottage behind the schoolhouse. It wouldn't be much, he'd written, but it was clean and private and included in her compensation. Pueblo itself was larger than she'd expected, a bustling town of several thousand people clustered where the Arkansas River cut through the high desert plains. The train station was substantial, with multiple platforms and a busy freight yard. Rebecca disembarked with a mix of excitement and trepidation, clutching her carpetbag and looking around at the organized chaos of arriving passengers and freight handlers. Miss Norton. A thin man in a dark suit approached, his mustache waxed to impressive points. "I'm Harold Thornton, president of the school board. We've been expecting you." Relief flooded through her. "Mr. Thornton, yes, thank you for meeting me. Of course, of course. Let me take your bag." The schoolhouse is just a short walk from here, on the edge of town near the church. I thought you'd want to see your accommodations right away, perhaps rest a bit before we conduct the formal interview this afternoon. Rebecca followed him through streets that mixed the rustic elements of a frontier town, with clear signs of growth and civilization. There were wooden sidewalks along the main thoroughfares, gas lamps at regular intervals, substantial brick buildings housing banks and shops alongside simpler structures of timber and adobe. People filled the streets, a mix of cowboys and farmers, ladies in fashionable dresses, Mexican families speaking rapid Spanish, Chinese laborers from the railroad, even a few Native Americans trading goods with a merchant. The schoolhouse stood at the town's western edge, a simple white building with a bell tower and a small yard surrounded by a fence. Behind it, just as promised, sat a tiny cottage, barely more than 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but it had glass windows with shutters and a front door that locked. Rebecca felt her eyes sting with unexpected tears. It wasn't much, but it was hers, the first place she could call home since her parents died. Mr. Thornton showed her around, pointing out the pump for water in the backyard, the small stable where she could keep a horse if she acquired one, the path that led to the main road. He left her to settle in, promising to return at 2 o'clock for the interview with the full school board. Rebecca spent the intervening hours unpacking her meager belongings, sweeping out the cottage, and trying to calm her nerves. Everything depended on this interview, on convincing these strangers that she was capable of educating their children. The interview itself proved less daunting than she'd feared. The school board consisted of Mr. Thornton, the reverend from the local church, and 2 women, Mrs. Martinez and Mrs. Chen, who asked thoughtful questions about her teaching philosophy and experience. Rebecca answered honestly, describing her own education, and the year she'd spent assisting at the school in Wichita before her parents fell ill. She outlined her plans for lessons, her belief in education for all children regardless of background, her commitment to maintaining discipline while fostering genuine love of learning. At the end of the hour, the board members exchanged satisfied nods. "Miss Norton," Mr. Thornton said formally, "it is our pleasure to offer you the position of schoolteacher for Pueblo Elementary. School begins the first Monday in September, which gives you 2 weeks to prepare your lessons and familiarize yourself with the town. Your salary will be $40 per month, paid on the 1st of each month, with the cottage and firewood provided in addition." Rebecca accepted with gratitude that threatened to spill over into undignified tears. They shook hands all around, and she was given a roster of expected students, 23 names ranging in age from 6 to 14. She scanned the list and found it there, Sarah Dalton, age 14, and her heart did that strange flutter again. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Rebecca scrubbed the schoolhouse until it gleamed, organized the few books and supplies available, began planning lessons for students of wildly varying ages and abilities. She met some of the parents, who regarded her with cautious optimism, clearly hoping she'd last longer than her predecessor. She learned the layout of Pueblo, where to buy supplies, which establishments were respectable and which to avoid. And through it all, humming beneath her awareness like a persistent melody, was anticipation for Saturday. Preston arrived at her cottage precisely at noon, looking considerably cleaner than when she'd first met him, wearing what was clearly his good shirt and with his dark hair still damp from washing. He swept off his hat when she opened the door, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Miss Norton, you're looking well. That bruise has nearly faded." "Preston," she said warmly, "please come in. Though I'm afraid there's not much to see, I'm still getting settled." He stepped inside, his large frame making the small cottage seem even tinier. His eyes traveled over the neat room, the small trunk that held her possessions, the wildflowers she'd picked and placed in a jar on the table. "Looks like home to me. You've done wonders with the place." They walked into town together, Preston pointing out various landmarks and sharing bits of local history. He took her to a small restaurant run by a German couple, where they served schnitzel and potato pancakes that Rebecca declared the best thing she'd tasted in months. Over lunch, they talked easily, the initial awkwardness melting away as they discovered shared interests and values. Preston told her about his ranch, the challenges of the cattle business, his hopes to expand someday. He spoke of Sarah with clear pride and exasperation in equal measure, describing a girl caught between childhood and womanhood, brilliant but restless, curious about everything. "She needs a good teacher," he said seriously. "Someone who can challenge her mind, help her see there's more to life than this one small town. I worry about her sometimes, that she'll feel trapped out here." "I'll do my best with her," Rebecca promised. "With all of them." "I know you will," Preston said, and the confidence in his voice made her sit a little straighter. After lunch, he showed her more of Pueblo, the library that a benefactor had established, the park along the river where families gathered on Sundays, the new opera house that brought traveling performers. They ended up at the general store, where Preston insisted on buying her supplies for the cottage, practical things like lamp oil and coffee, and a good knife for cooking. When she protested the expense, he simply said, "Consider it a housewarming gift. Every home needs proper supplies." They were standing in front of the store, Preston loading her purchases into a borrowed cart, when a group of cowboys rode past. One of them, a rough-looking man with a scarred face and mean eyes, reined in his horse and called out, "Well, if it isn't Preston Dalton, playing nursemaid to the new schoolmarm. Didn't know you were in the market for a wife, Dalton. Or is this just a different kind of arrangement?" The crude implication hung in the air like something foul. Rebecca felt her face flame, but Preston's reaction was controlled, deliberate. He set down the bag he was holding and turned slowly to face the man. "You'll want to apologize to the lady, Garrett. Right now." Garrett laughed, a harsh sound. "Or what? You'll make me." "We both know you're not a gunfighter, Dalton. Just a dirt farmer playing at ranching." "Don't need to be a gunfighter to defend a lady's honor," Preston said quietly, but there was steel beneath the words. "Now apologize, or you and I will settle this another way." The tension stretched out, and Rebecca found herself holding her breath. Violence was common enough in towns like this, she knew, disputes settled with fists or worse. But Preston didn't seem angry exactly, just resolved, like a man who'd accepted an unpleasant but necessary task. Something in his stance must have convinced Garrett, because the cowboy finally muttered, "No offense meant, madam," before spurring his horse forward. His companions followed, throwing back looks that were half amused, half wary. Preston watched them go, then turned back to Rebecca with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry you had to see that. Garrett and I have history. He worked for me briefly, couple years back. I had to let him go after he mistreated one of the horses. He's held a grudge ever since." "You didn't have to defend me," Rebecca said softly, "but I appreciate that you did. Any decent man would have done the same." But Rebecca suspected that wasn't entirely true. She'd seen men ignore or even participate in crude behavior toward women. Preston's immediate and unequivocal defense meant something. The incident cast a brief shadow over the afternoon, but it lifted as they made their way back to her cottage, Preston pulling the cart with her supplies. He helped her carry everything inside, then lingered at the door, clearly reluctant to leave. "I had a real nice time today," he said. "Best Saturday I've had in a long while." "I did too," Rebecca admitted. "Thank you for showing me around, for the supplies, for everything. Could I come by again next week? Maybe we could take a ride out to the ranch, let you meet Sarah. She's been pestering me with questions about her new teacher." "I'd love that." Preston's smile was like sunrise. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell, then mounted his horse and rode off, turning once to wave before disappearing down the road. Rebecca stood in her doorway watching him go, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart was doing acrobatics. The following Saturday, Preston arrived with a gentle mare saddled and ready for Rebecca. "Borrowed her from a neighbor," he explained. "She's got an easy gait, perfect for a rider who might be a bit rusty." Rebecca hadn't ridden much, but she'd learned the basics as a girl, and the skills came back as they set out across the prairie. Preston kept the pace easy, pointing out landmarks and property boundaries. His ranch, when they reached it, was modest but well-maintained. A small house with a barn and several outbuildings, corrals holding horses and cattle, fields of hay ripening in the late summer sun. Sarah burst out of the house before they'd even dismounted, a whirlwind of energy in a faded dress, with long dark hair in a braid and Preston's same green eyes. "You're Miss Norton. I can't believe Preston actually convinced a lady to come out here. He's usually so awkward around women." "Sarah," Preston said warningly, but there was affection in his tone. The girl laughed, completely unrepentant. "Well, it's true. You should have seen him trying to talk to the banker's daughter last year. He turned red as a beet and could barely string 3 words together." "That's because I had no interest in the banker's daughter," Preston said mildly, dismounting and helping Rebecca down. "Now why don't you show Miss Norton some hospitality instead of embarrassing your brother?" Sarah grabbed Rebecca's hand with easy familiarity. "Come inside. I made lemonade, and we have cookies that aren't even burned this time. Preston says I'm a terrible baker, but I'm getting better, I swear." The afternoon passed in delightful chaos. Sarah was exactly as Preston had described, whip-smart and energetic, asking 100 questions about Rebecca's plans for the school year. What books they'd read, whether she knew anything about science, because Sarah was desperate to learn about biology and chemistry. Rebecca found herself charmed by the girl's enthusiasm and impressed by her obvious intelligence. "She reads everything she can get her hands on," Preston said later, when Sarah had gone to check on the chickens. They sat on the porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I try to get her books from Denver when I can, but it's not the same as having a proper teacher. She needs more than I can give her." "You've done an amazing job," Rebecca said sincerely. "She's confident, curious, well-mannered. That's all because of you." Preston looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what needed doing, but I'm grateful she'll have you now, grateful for a lot of things, actually." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Rebecca, I know we've only known each other a couple weeks, but I find myself thinking about you constantly. Wondering how you're settling in, if you need anything, just wanting to see you smile. I realize I'm probably rushing things, but I'm not a man who plays games or hides his feelings. I like you a great deal, and I'd like to court you proper if you're amenable." Rebecca's breath caught. She'd known this was building between them, felt it in every glance and conversation, but hearing him say it aloud made it real and immediate and terrifying. "Preston, I like you too. But I need you to understand something. I came here alone, with nothing but my teaching certificate and determination. This position, this cottage, it's the first security I've had since my parents died. I can't risk losing it, and in many places, female teachers are expected to remain unmarried." "I've already spoken to the school board about that," Preston said quietly. "Made some inquiries. Pueblo doesn't have that restriction. Plenty of married women work here when needed. Your position would be safe." The fact that he'd thought ahead, that he'd checked, made Rebecca's heart swell. "I also need you to understand that I won't be some wife who stays home and keeps house while her husband makes all the decisions. I have thoughts and opinions, and I need a partner who respects them." "Wouldn't want it any other way," Preston said. "I've been making my own decisions and Sarah's for 10 years now. Would be a relief to have someone to talk things through with, someone whose mind I respect as much as I respect yours." Rebecca studied his face in the fading light, searching for any sign of insincerity, but she found only openness and hope. "Then yes," she said softly. "I'd be honored if you'd court me." Preston's answering smile was brilliant. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough with calluses, his grip gentle. They sat like that as darkness fell, hand in hand on the porch, while Sarah's voice drifted from the barn where she was singing to the animals. And Rebecca thought that maybe, just maybe, being thrown off that train had been the best thing that ever happened to her. The weeks that followed established a pattern that felt as natural as breathing. School began, and Rebecca threw herself into teaching with passionate dedication. Her students ranged from 6-year-old twin boys who could barely sit still to Sarah, and 2 other 14-year-olds preparing for more advanced studies. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, basic science and geography, adapting lessons for different skill levels while keeping everyone engaged. Sarah proved to be both her best student and her greatest challenge, eager to learn but also quick to question anything that didn't make logical sense. More than once, Rebecca found herself researching topics late into the night just to stay ahead of the girls' voracious curiosity. But it was rewarding work, watching young minds expand and grow, seeing children who'd been uncertain readers become confident. Preston came to town every Saturday without fail, taking Rebecca to lunch or for walks along the river. He told her stories about his childhood, about growing up in Missouri and coming west with his parents seeking better opportunities, about the Ute raid that had killed them and left him orphan and guardian at once. She shared her own history, the quiet life in Wichita, her parents' slow decline from fever, the desperate loneliness that had followed. They discovered they both loved thunderstorms and hated the taste of liver. They debated politics and religion, finding they agreed on most fundamental things but approached them from different angles. Preston was practical and grounded, while Rebecca tended toward idealism. He tempered her sometimes unrealistic expectations, while she pushed him to think beyond the immediate and practical toward larger possibilities. "You should run for town council," she told him one October afternoon as they walked through Pueblo's growing residential area. "You're respected, you understand the needs of both ranchers and townspeople, and you actually think about long-term consequences instead of just quick fixes." Preston laughed. "I can barely keep up with the ranch and Sarah. When would I have time for politics?" Sarah's nearly grown. "In a few years, she'll be off to college or married. What will you do with all that energy then?" "Hopefully spend it with you," Preston said, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk and turning to face her. "That is, if you'll still have me around." "I can't imagine anything I'd want more," Rebecca said honestly. They'd been courting for 2 months, and every day made Rebecca more certain that Preston was the kind of man she'd thought existed only in novels. He was unfailingly kind but not weak, strong but not domineering, intelligent without being condescending. He treated her as an equal partner in their relationship, asking her opinion on ranch decisions and genuinely considering her input even when it differed from his initial thoughts. In November, Preston invited her to Thanksgiving dinner at the ranch. Sarah had been planning the menu for weeks, determined to prove her domestic skills had improved. The meal was actually quite good, though the pie crust was a bit tough, and Sarah held forth on the injustice of women being expected to excel at cooking when men were equally capable of learning. "She's been reading those suffragist pamphlets again," Preston said with fond exasperation after Sarah had gone to bed and they sat by the fire. Not that I disagree with her, mind you. Just makes me realize how fast she's growing up, forming her own opinions about the world. She'll do great things, Rebecca said. She has the intelligence and the passion. She just needs opportunity. That's what worries me, Preston admitted. Opportunity means leaving here, going somewhere with universities and options. And I want that for her. I truly do, but the thought of this house being empty, of being alone again after all these years, it sits heavy sometimes. Rebecca moved closer on the bench, resting her head against his shoulder. You won't be alone, not if I have anything to say about it. Preston's arm came around her, pulling her close. They'd been careful about physical affection, maintaining propriety, but in the privacy of his home with Sarah sleeping upstairs, Rebecca allowed herself to relax into his embrace. It felt right, being held by him, safe and cherished in a way she'd never experienced before. Rebecca, Preston said quietly, I love you. I think I started falling that very first day, watching you dust yourself off and keep your dignity despite everything. You're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I want to spend my life with you. Rebecca's eyes stung with happy tears. I love you too, so much it scares me sometimes. Nothing to be scared of, Preston murmured against her hair. We'll figure it out together, whatever comes. They sat like that for a long while, wrapped in each other's arms, and when Preston finally drove her back to town in his wagon, Rebecca felt like she was floating. This was what happiness felt like, she realized. Not the absence of challenges or worries, but facing them with someone you loved by your side. December brought cold weather and preparations for the school's Christmas program. Rebecca threw herself into organizing it, drilling her students on recitations and songs, while Sarah helped paint scenery and sew costumes. Preston contributed by building a small stage in the schoolhouse, working late into the evenings with hammer and saw while Rebecca graded papers by lamplight. You know, everyone in town is going to see this as us being practically married, Preston commented one night as they worked side by side. The teacher and the rancher doing domestic projects together. There'll be talk. Let them talk, Rebecca said, unless you're worried about your reputation. My reputation can handle it, Preston said. But yours is more delicate. I don't want to cause problems for you with the school board. Then make an honest woman of me, Rebecca said lightly, not quite meeting his eyes as she stitched a shepherd's costume. The hammer stopped mid-swing. What did you say? Rebecca set down her sewing and looked at him directly. I'm saying that I don't want to wait anymore. We love each other. We know we want a future together. Why delay it? Preston set down the hammer carefully, then crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside her chair. Rebecca Norton, are you proposing to me? I suppose I am, she said, half laughing, half crying. Unless you'd rather do the asking. Oh, I'm definitely doing the asking, Preston said. He took both her hands in his. Rebecca, my love, my heart, would you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife? I don't have much to offer besides a small ranch and a teenage sister and my whole entire heart, but they're all yours if you'll have them. Yes, Rebecca said through her tears. Yes, absolutely yes. Preston pulled her down from the chair and kissed her, tender and sweet and full of promise. It was her first kiss, and it was perfect, tasting of happiness and hope and home. They were married 3 weeks later in the church where Rebecca had interviewed with the school board. Sarah served as maid of honor, beaming with delight, while Preston's closest friend, another rancher named Thomas, stood up as best man. Mrs. Henderson came down from Boone for the occasion, crying openly through the ceremony. Half the town attended, filling the small church to capacity. Rebecca wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool that Mrs. Martinez had helped her sew, and she carried wildflowers despite the winter cold. Preston wore his best suit, his hair slicked back, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle. Reverend Potter conducted a brief but heartfelt ceremony, and when Preston kissed his bride, the congregation erupted in applause. The reception was held in the schoolhouse, which the community had decorated with pine boughs and ribbon. There was music and dancing, food that families had contributed, speeches that ranged from sentimental to hilarious. Sarah gave a toast that made everyone laugh, declaring that she'd finally have someone to help rein in Preston's stubborn streak, and that Miss Norton better be prepared for the Dalton family chaos. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Preston pulled Rebecca aside. "I have something for you," he said, pressing a small box into her hands. Inside was a delicate gold locket, clearly old with intricate engraving on the front. "It was my mother's," Preston explained. "The only thing of hers I kept after the raid. I've been saving it, thinking that someday I'd give it to the woman I married. Now that day is here, and I can't imagine anyone more deserving of it than you." Rebecca's hands trembled as she lifted the locket from the box. Inside were two tiny photographs, a young couple she recognized as Preston's parents. "It's beautiful. I'll treasure it always." Preston fastened it around her neck, his fingers lingering on her skin. "Shall we go home, Mrs. Dalton? Home." She was going home with her husband to their house and their life and their future. Rebecca smiled through happy tears. "Yes, let's go home." The ranch house had been transformed in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Preston and Sarah had worked together to make room for Rebecca's belongings, to turn the spare room into a proper study where she could prepare lessons and grade papers. There were new curtains in the bedroom, a quilt Sarah had painstakingly stitched as a wedding gift, wildflowers in jars on every surface despite the winter season. Sarah hugged them both when they arrived, then tactfully announced she was going to bed early, leaving the newlyweds alone. Preston carried Rebecca over the threshold in the traditional way, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the parlor. "Are you nervous?" he asked softly, cupping her face in his hands. "A little," Rebecca admitted. "But mostly I'm just happy, happier than I knew was possible." "Me too," Preston said. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. "We'll take things slow, all right. No rush. I just want you to feel safe and loved." And she did feel safe, wrapped in his arms, trusting him completely. What happened next was tender and sweet, Preston's gentleness making up for his own limited experience, both of them learning together, finding joy in the discovery of each other. Later, lying in the darkness with her head on Preston's chest and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Rebecca thought back to that day on the train, to the moment she'd been thrown off and thought her life was ending. How could she have known that falling was actually the beginning? That the worst moment of her life would lead directly to the best? "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, his voice drowsy and content. "How grateful I am," Rebecca said, "for all of it, even the hard parts that led me here." "Me too," Preston murmured. "Best investment I ever made, that train ticket." Rebecca smiled in the darkness. "I still owe you for that, you know, and for the boarding house." "You can pay me back by staying right here forever," Preston said. "That's fair trade in my book." "Deal," Rebecca whispered, and sealed it with a kiss. Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Rebecca continued teaching, though she moved from the cottage to the ranch, making the daily commute by wagon when weather permitted and sometimes staying in town during the worst winter storms. Preston adjusted his schedule to accommodate hers, handling morning chores early so he could drive her to school, using the time in Pueblo to conduct business and make connections that gradually expanded his ranching operation. Sarah blossomed under Rebecca's daily influence, her sharp mind finally getting the consistent challenge it needed. By spring, Rebecca was preparing her for entrance examinations to the Colorado Seminary in Denver, a bold plan that initially worried Preston. "She's only 15, he said one evening as they reviewed Sarah's study schedule. "Denver's so far away. What if something happens? What if she needs help? Then we'll be there," Rebecca said calmly. "It's not the moon, Preston. It's a train ride, and she needs this. Her mind is too extraordinary to limit to what we can provide here." Preston sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know you're right. Doesn't make it easier to think about her leaving." "No," Rebecca agreed, "but loving someone means wanting what's best for them even when it's hard for us." In May, Sarah traveled to Denver with Rebecca as her chaperone and took the entrance examinations. She passed with scores high enough to earn a partial scholarship, reducing the financial burden on Preston. The family celebrated with a special dinner, though Preston's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," he told Sarah. "More than I can say. You're going to do amazing things." "I'll come home for holidays," Sarah promised, "and I'll write every week. You won't even have time to miss me." But they did miss her when September came and she departed for Denver, the house suddenly too quiet without her energy and constant chatter. Preston threw himself into ranch work with almost desperate intensity, and Rebecca found herself preparing lessons in the evenings just to have something to occupy her mind beyond the emptiness. "It's like losing them all over again," Preston admitted one night, breaking down in tears for the first time since Rebecca had known him. "My parents, now Sarah. Everyone I love leaves eventually." "I'm not leaving," Rebecca said fiercely, holding him close. "I'm right here and I'm staying." "You're stuck with me, Preston Dalton, for better or worse. Promise?" he asked, his voice small and vulnerable in a way that broke her heart. "Promise," she said. "We're building something here, you and me. A life, a partnership. Sarah's not gone forever, she's just spreading her wings. And who knows? Maybe we'll eventually fill this house with enough noise that you'll wish for the quiet." Preston managed a watery laugh. "You saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that I wouldn't mind giving Sarah some younger siblings eventually, if you're interested in that." "Interested doesn't begin to cover it," Preston said, pulling her closer. "The thought of having children with you, of building a real family, it's everything I've wanted but didn't dare hope for." "Then let's hope," Rebecca whispered. "Together." Their hopes were answered the following spring when Rebecca discovered she was expecting. The pregnancy was relatively easy, though she had to stop teaching in her 7th month when climbing the schoolhouse steps became too difficult. The school board was understanding, hiring a temporary replacement with the understanding that Rebecca would return once the baby was old enough to leave with a nursemaid. Sarah came home from Denver in June, having completed her first year with honors, and was beside herself with excitement about becoming an aunt. She read every book on childbirth and infant care she could find, driving Preston to distraction with statistics about maternal mortality and proper nutrition. "You're going to worry yourself sick," Preston told her. "Rebecca's young and healthy. Doc Harris says everything looks fine." "Statistics show that even healthy women can experience complications," Sarah countered. "It's important to be prepared." "What's important is staying calm and positive," Rebecca interjected. She was enormous now, moving slowly and uncomfortably in the July heat, but generally content. "The baby and I are both fine. Strong heartbeat, good movement. In a few more weeks, you'll all be so exhausted from crying and feeding around the clock that you'll forget what you were worried about." The baby, a boy they named Peter, arrived on a sweltering afternoon in mid-August after 12 hours of labor. Doc Harris oversaw the delivery with Sarah assisting, having convinced him to let her observe for educational purposes. Preston paced the porch, unable to handle being in the room despite Rebecca's request for his presence, emerging only when he heard his son's first lusty cry. "He's perfect," Preston breathed, cradling the tiny bundle with shaking hands. Tears streamed down his face unashamedly. "Rebecca, he's absolutely perfect." "Of course he is," Rebecca said, exhausted but glowing. "He's ours." Peter was indeed perfect, a healthy baby with his father's dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same sage green. He was also, to everyone's surprise, remarkably calm, sleeping in long stretches and rarely fussing unless hungry or needing changing. Sarah was besotted with her nephew, spending hours just watching him sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. "It's like a miracle," she said one evening, holding Peter while Rebecca rested. "This whole perfect person who didn't exist a year ago, and now he's here and he's part of our family forever." "That's exactly what it is," Preston agreed. He sat beside Rebecca's bed, her hand in his, watching his sister cradle his son. "A miracle. Several miracles, actually, that I found Rebecca, that we built this life, that we're all here together. Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe it's real." "It's real," Rebecca assured him. "All of it. Every beautiful, imperfect, precious bit of it." Sarah returned to Denver in September, though she wrote home constantly demanding updates on Peter's every milestone. Rebecca resumed teaching in October, bringing Peter with her to school. The arrangement raised some eyebrows initially, but when it became clear that the baby slept peacefully in a basket in the corner and Rebecca's teaching quality hadn't diminished, objections faded. Several mothers actually commented that having an infant present taught the students something about care and responsibility. The years that followed were full ones. Peter grew into a sturdy, curious toddler, then a bright boy who loved following his father around the ranch. Sarah graduated from the seminary and, to everyone's surprise, moved back to Pueblo, having secured a position as assistant to Doc Harris. She discovered a passion for medicine during her studies and was determined to eventually attend a proper medical school back east. "The world is changing," she told the family over Sunday dinner one autumn evening. "Women are becoming doctors, lawyers, all sorts of things. I want to be part of that change to prove that we're just as capable as men." "We never doubted it," Preston said. "Though I worry about you facing opposition and prejudice." "Let them try," Sarah said with a fierce grin. "I've got too much Dalton stubbornness to quit just because someone thinks I shouldn't be doing something." Rebecca and Preston exchanged amused glances. Sarah at 21 was even more formidable than she'd been as a teenager, and woe to anyone who underestimated her. When Peter was 4, Rebecca found herself expecting again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, with persistent nausea and exhaustion that made teaching difficult. The school board, recognizing her years of dedicated service, suggested she take the term off and return the following year. Rebecca reluctantly agreed, hating to leave her students but recognizing her own limitations. The second baby, a girl they named Rachel, arrived on a snowy February morning in 1888. She was smaller than Peter had been, with wispy blonde hair and eyes that matched Rebecca's hazel ones. Where Peter had been calm, Rachel was a whirlwind from the start, demanding constant attention and making her preferences known with powerful lungs. "She's going to be a handful," Preston said fondly, walking the floor at 2 in the morning with his screaming daughter. "Got your determination and Sarah's stubbornness. God help us all." "She's perfect," Rebecca said drowsily from the bed. "They both are, and they were." Rachel grew into a fearless little girl who climbed everything, demanded answers to endless questions, and charmed everyone she met. Peter was gentle with his baby sister, protective and patient even when she knocked over his carefully built block towers or interrupted his games. The ranch prospered under Preston's careful management. He'd gradually expanded their holdings, buying adjoining property when it became available, improving his breeding stock, developing a reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle. By 1890, the Dalton Ranch was one of the most successful in the region, and Preston had indeed been elected to the town council, serving 2 terms and helping guide Pueblo's continued growth. Rebecca returned to teaching when Rachel turned 3, hiring a young woman named Emma to help with the children during school hours. She found that her years of experience made her more effective than ever, able to connect with students of all backgrounds and abilities. Several of her former students had gone on to higher education, and she took quiet pride in knowing she'd helped shape their futures. One Saturday in spring, Rebecca and Preston left the children with Sarah and rode out to the place where they'd first met. The railroad tracks still cut through the prairie there, trains passing regularly now as commerce expanded. They stood hand in hand, looking at the spot where Rebecca had tumbled down the embankment nearly a decade earlier. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been riding that ridge that day?" Preston asked. "If I'd been somewhere else, doing something different, I try not to," Rebecca admitted. "It's too frightening to contemplate, though I suppose I would have survived somehow. I'm more resourceful than I knew back then." "You would have been fine," Preston agreed, "but I wouldn't have been. I'd still be alone in that house, going through the motions of living without really understanding what I was missing. You gave me everything, Rebecca. Purpose and joy and love and family. You saved me just as surely as I helped you that day." Rebecca turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. There was gray threading through his dark hair now, lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but he was still the most handsome man she'd ever seen. "We saved each other. That's what love is, I think. Not one person rescuing another, but both people choosing every day to build something together." Preston kissed her there on the prairie, surrounded by wildflowers and endless sky, and Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. All the fear and uncertainty, the hard work and sacrifice, the joy and laughter and tears. It had been worth it, every single second, to end up here with this man and the life they'd created together. Sarah eventually did go east to medical school, becoming one of the first female physicians in Colorado when she returned with her degree. She married a fellow doctor, a kind man named James who admired her brilliance and supported her ambitions. They settled in Pueblo and opened a practice together, treating patients regardless of their ability to pay, earning the community's deep respect. Peter grew into a thoughtful young man who loved both ranching and books, eventually studying agriculture at the state college and returning home to help modernize the ranch with new techniques and breeds. Rachel became a teacher like her mother, though she specialized in mathematics and science, subjects that were her particular passions. She fought for and won the right to teach at the high school level, proving that women could handle advanced subjects just as well as men. Preston and Rebecca grew old together on the ranch, watching their children and eventually grandchildren fill the house with noise and energy. Peter married a rancher's daughter and gave them 3 grandchildren. Rachel married late, choosing a professor she met while pursuing her own advanced degree, and they had 2 children who were as curious and fearless as their mother. On their 20th anniversary, Preston took Rebecca back to the train station where he'd purchased her ticket to Pueblo. The old wooden building had been replaced by a substantial brick structure, reflecting the town's growth, but the platform was in roughly the same place. 20 years, Rebecca marveled. It feels like both a lifetime and yesterday. Best 20 years of my life, Preston said. Every single day with you has been a gift, even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones, maybe, because we faced them together. Do you remember what you told me that first day? That buying my ticket was an investment in education, Preston laughed. I remember. Best investment I ever made, though not for the reasons I claimed. Changed my whole life, that $3 ticket. Changed mine too, Rebecca said softly. Took me from my lowest point to heights I never dreamed possible. I was so scared that day, so certain I'd made a terrible mistake coming west, but it turned out to be the best decision I ever made. They walked through Pueblo hand in hand, observing how much had changed since Rebecca's arrival. The town had grown from a few thousand to nearly 20,000 people. There were electric lights on the main streets now, telephone lines connecting businesses, automobiles beginning to appear alongside horses and wagons. The schoolhouse where Rebecca had taught for nearly 20 years had expanded multiple times to accommodate growing enrollment, but some things hadn't changed. The church where they'd married still stood, its bell ringing out every Sunday. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house in Boone still took in travelers, though Mrs. Henderson herself had passed on and her daughter ran it now. The river still flowed through town, families still gathered in the park, and the prairie still stretched endlessly toward distant mountains. As the sun set on their anniversary evening, painting the sky in those familiar shades of gold and crimson, Preston pulled Rebecca close on their porch, the same porch where he'd first told her he loved her. Their children were grown now, living their own lives, though they visited often. The house was quiet again, just the two of them like in those early days, but it was a comfortable quiet, full of shared history and understanding. I love you, Rebecca Dalton, Preston said, the words as heartfelt as the first time he'd spoken them. More than when we started, if that's even possible. You've made every day an adventure and every moment meaningful. I can't imagine having lived any other life but this one with you. I love you too, Rebecca said, her eyes bright with happy tears. You took a chance on a desperate woman with nothing to offer but determination, and you gave me everything. A home, a family, a partnership, a love I'll carry with me always. You're my miracle, Preston, my unexpected blessing. And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat, every stumble and struggle, just to end up right here with you. They sat together as darkness fell, watching stars emerge one by one in the vast Colorado sky. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded, carrying new arrivals toward Pueblo, toward their own destinies and dreams. Rebecca thought about all the people who'd been pushed off metaphorical trains in their lives, facing moments where everything seemed lost. She hoped they'd all find their own Preston, their own unexpected savior who became something far more precious than rescue. The years continued to unfold with grace and purpose. Preston and Rebecca celebrated their silver anniversary surrounded by family. 25 years of marriage that had produced not just children and grandchildren, but a legacy of love and community service. Both had remained active despite advancing age, Preston still consulting on ranch operations even as Peter took over daily management, Rebecca still tutoring students who struggled with reading and mathematics. They traveled some in their later years, taking a train back to Missouri to visit Preston's childhood home, touring the East Coast so Rebecca could see the ocean for the first time. But they always returned to Pueblo, to the ranch, to the place where their story had truly begun. Home was where they'd built their life together, where every corner held memories, where they could sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the prairie they both loved. Sarah's medical practice thrived, and she became known throughout Colorado for her innovative treatments and her advocacy for public health measures. She established a clinic specifically for treating women and children, recognizing that many had special needs that male physicians often dismissed or misunderstood. Her nieces and nephews grew up seeing their aunt as proof that women could be anything they chose, that determination and education could overcome society's limitations. Peter expanded the ranch beyond even Preston's ambitious dreams, incorporating new technologies while maintaining the ethical treatment of animals and land that his father had instilled. He became a leader in the Colorado Cattlemen's Association, advocating for fair practices and conservation. His children grew up learning to ride almost before they could walk, inheriting their grandfather's love for the land and their grandmother's commitment to education. Rachel's work as a mathematics teacher inspired a generation of young women to pursue sciences and engineering. She fought constant battles against administrators who believed girls needed only basic arithmetic, but her students' successes proved her methods. Several went on to become engineers and scientists themselves, writing to thank her for opening doors they hadn't known existed. As Preston and Rebecca entered their 60s, they slowed down physically, but remained sharp mentally, still engaged with the community and their growing family. They were beloved figures in Pueblo, the rancher and the teacher who'd helped shape the town's character through decades of service and example. Young couples sought their advice, neighbors relied on their wisdom, and the community recognized them as living links to the town's earlier, wilder days. One summer evening, sitting on their porch as they'd done countless times before, Preston said quietly, "I've been thinking about that day we met. How you looked so dignified even covered in dust, how determined you were to make your own way without accepting charity. I fell in love with your strength before I even knew your name." Rebecca smiled, reaching for his hand. "I fell in love with your kindness, the way you defended my honor to Garrett, the way you talked about Sarah with such love, the way you saw me as a person rather than just a problem to be solved. You made me feel valued when I was at my lowest point." "We were both lucky that day," Preston said. "Lucky that I happened to be riding that ridge, lucky that you survived the fall, lucky that we had sense enough to recognize something special when we found it." "Not luck," Rebecca corrected gently. "Providence, fate, whatever you want to call it. We were meant to find each other, meant to build this life together. I believe that with my whole heart." They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1902, a grand affair with the entire community invited. The party was held at the ranch, now spanning thousands of acres and employing dozens of workers. Tents were erected on the lawn, tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by well-wishers, and a band played music that drew people to dance despite the summer heat. Preston and Rebecca opened the dancing, moving together with the ease of 4 decades of partnership. Their children and grandchildren watched with shining eyes, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a love that had deepened and strengthened with time rather than fading. "To 40 more years," Preston whispered as they danced. "However many were granted," Rebecca amended. "But yes, to every precious day we have left together." They were granted another 12 years, 12 years of watching great-grandchildren be born, of seeing the world change in ways they'd never imagined. Automobiles became common, airplanes took to the skies, and the wild west of their youth became a thing of memory and legend. But through all the changes, their love remained constant, a fixed point in a shifting world. Preston passed first, in the winter of 1914, dying peacefully in his sleep at age 73 with Rebecca holding his hand. The town mourned the loss of one of its founding pillars, but no one grieved as deeply as Rebecca, who felt like half her soul had been torn away. For 52 years, Preston had been her partner, her love, her best friend, and the world felt impossibly empty without him. But she carried on, drawing strength from her children and grandchildren, from the community Preston had helped build, from the memories of a life well lived together. She continued to tutor students, to attend family gatherings, to sit on the porch in the evenings and remember all the conversations she and Preston had shared there. Rebecca lived another 3 years, long enough to see the World War end and the soldiers return home, long enough to hold her first great-great-grandchild, long enough to know that the legacy she and Preston had created would continue long after they were gone. She passed quietly one spring morning in 1917, sitting in her favorite chair on the porch with a blanket over her knees and a book in her lap, simply failing to wake from an afternoon nap. The family buried her beside Preston on a hill overlooking the ranch with a simple headstone that read, "Rebecca Dalton, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher, 1857–1917. Beneath it, a line she'd requested, "She fell and he helped her rise. Together they soared." The ranch passed to Peter and eventually to his children, remaining in the Dalton family for generations. The schoolhouse where Rebecca had taught was eventually replaced by a modern building, but they named it Rebecca Dalton Elementary in her honor, with a plaque in the entrance telling her story. The cottage where she'd first lived alone was preserved as a historical site, a reminder of the brave teachers who'd brought education to the frontier. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, people walking past the old ranch house claimed they could hear laughter on the wind, could see shadows of 2 figures dancing on the porch, could feel the lingering presence of a love that had been so strong it seemed to echo through time itself. The story of how Preston Dalton had helped Rebecca Norton when she was pushed from a train became local legend, told and retold by generations of Pueblo residents. It became shorthand for the power of kindness, proof that a single moment of compassion could change lives in ways no one could predict. Schoolchildren learned about Rebecca's determination and Preston's generosity. Young couples held them up as examples of what marriage could be. And always, the story ended the same way, with 2 people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that lasted. In the end, that was their greatest legacy, not the ranch or the students taught or the community service, important as those were. Their greatest legacy was the proof that love, real love, was possible even in the hardest circumstances. That 2 people could meet at rock bottom and lift each other to heights neither could have reached alone. That kindness mattered, that character mattered, that choosing to help a stranger could lead to the greatest blessing of a lifetime. Rebecca had been pushed off a train with nothing but determination and a carpetbag full of dreams. Preston had extended his hand to help her up, and then never let go, walking beside her through every joy and sorrow for more than half a century. Together, they'd proven that the best love stories aren't about perfection or ease, but about 2 imperfect people committing to face life together, come what may. And as the prairie winds continued to blow across the Colorado landscape, carrying the whispers of their story to anyone who cared to listen, one truth remained crystal clear. Sometimes the worst moments in life are actually doorways to the best ones, and sometimes falling is just the first step toward learning to fly.